The day we buried my son, I was standing by the window in my own living room when his wife walked over and told me I had 30 days to leave. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside with any particular kindness. She just walked up, looked me in the eye, and said it the way you'd tell someone their parking meter was about to expire. "You need to start making arrangements, Walter. This house is mine now." David would want me to be practical. I nodded once. I didn't say anything back. Not because I had nothing to say. I had plenty. But there's a filing cabinet in the basement of that house, 4 drawers, locked, labeled by decade. And I knew exactly what was in it. So I nodded, and I looked out the window at the yard I had graded by hand in the spring of 1989, and I let her keep talking. She had no idea what she was standing on. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 69 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Dayton, Ohio, for 36 years. I built it, not with my own hands entirely, but with my own money, my own decisions, and a contractor I met at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. My late wife Carol and I broke ground in April of 1988. We moved in the following February with a newborn and 2 folding chairs because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. That house was never anybody's but mine. My son Daniel understood that. He grew up knowing the difference between living somewhere and owning it. He became a structural engineer, careful by nature, organized by training. He wasn't careless with facts. He just wasn't always specific with his wife about where things came from. That was a gap she filled in with her own assumptions. Her name is Renee. She and Daniel had been married for 8 years when he was killed in a highway accident on a Tuesday morning in early October. She was 34. She was a licensed real estate agent. She had confidence in her understanding of how property and money worked. And somewhere in those 8 years of marriage, she had constructed a version of our family's finances that made sense to her. And that version placed Daniel at the center of everything and me at the edges, dependent, limited, quietly coasting on his generosity. I never corrected her, not because I was afraid to, more because it never seemed necessary. Until it did. The funeral was on a Thursday. Renee had arranged everything. The flowers, the casket, the printed programs. She did it efficiently. I'll give her that. There's a kind of grief that expresses itself through control, and that was hers. I sat in the third pew and watched her shake hands with people I'd known for decades. She accepted condolences with a steady voice and a black dress that looked like it had been purchased specifically for the occasion. My neighbor Ruth Halverson sat beside me for part of the service. Ruth has lived 2 doors down since 1991. She squeezed my hand once and didn't say much, which was exactly right. After the graveside, we went back to the house. People filled the kitchen, the living room, the back patio. I stood near the fireplace for a while. Someone had moved Carol's photos off the mantel. Not all of them, but 2 of the framed ones I kept in the same spot for 6 years since she passed. I noticed the space where they'd been. I didn't say anything. Renee moved through the room the way she moved through open houses, reading the space, positioning herself, controlling the flow. Around 7 o'clock, she pulled me aside near the hallway. She said she'd been thinking about the transition. She said Daniel had been covering a lot of my expenses and that now, with him gone, the situation wasn't sustainable. She said she wanted to be upfront with me rather than let things drag. "I've already looked at a few senior communities," she said. "There are some decent options in your price range." I looked at her for a moment. "We can talk about that later," I said. She nodded, satisfied with that. She thought later meant agreement. It didn't. That night, after the last car pulled out of the driveway, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the quiet of an empty house. The table was the same one Carol and I had bought at an estate sale in 1986. Oak, slightly uneven on one leg, fixed with a folded piece of cardboard under the foot. We'd always meant to replace it. We never did. I sat there for a long time. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger would have been a distraction. What I felt was more like recognition. The moment when you realize a situation has been developing for longer than you noticed, and that it's now asking you to respond. I thought about the filing cabinet downstairs. I thought about the trust documents in the back of the bottom drawer. I thought about Renee's voice, confident, organized, certain, and I thought about how certainty without information is just a different word for a mistake waiting to happen. Then I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up at 6:15 the way I always do. I made coffee in the same percolator I've had since 2003, the kind with the glass top that lets you watch it bubble. Carol bought it at a hardware store clearance sale, and I've replaced the cord twice, but never the machine. It makes good coffee, and it works, and I don't need more reason than that to keep something. I stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree I planted in 1994 had lost most of its leaves by now. The garden beds along the back fence were finished for the season. Carol's beds, though I'd maintained them since she passed. The yard was quiet and gray in the early light, and it looked exactly like it always looked in November, and that steadiness was something I was grateful for. Renee had a key to the house. Daniel had given it to her years ago, which was reasonable at the time. She used it that morning without knocking. I heard the front door open around 9. She came into the kitchen with a folder under her arm and sat down across from me without asking. She was dressed for work, blazer, heels, hair pulled back. She looked like someone who had already decided how the meeting was going to go. "I wanted to go over some numbers with you," she said. She opened the folder. Inside was a legal pad covered in her handwriting. Columns of figures, some circled, some underlined. "I've been trying to get a handle on what Daniel was covering for you each month," she said. "Property taxes, utilities, insurance. I need to understand the full picture before I can figure out next steps." I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat back down. "What makes you think Daniel was covering those things?" I asked. She looked up from the legal pad. "Because you're on a fixed income, Walter. Social Security doesn't go far enough to carry a house like this. It's just math." "Whose math?" She paused, just briefly. Then she said, "I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm trying to be organized about it." I nodded. "Did Daniel ever show you a mortgage statement for this house?" I asked. She set her pen down. "We kept our finances mostly separate." "Did you ever see him write a check for property taxes? Receive a bill in his name for utilities here?" "He handled things online. He was private about money. So you never actually saw any of those payments." She picked her pen back up. "Walter, I was married to him for 8 years. I know what he was doing." I didn't push further. There was no point yet. She was building a case on inference and habit, and the time to respond to it wasn't at my kitchen table on a Friday morning with a legal pad between us. The time was later, in the right setting, with the right documents. "I'll think about what you've said," I told her. She took that as cooperation. She left around 10, heels clicking on the hardwood floors I'd installed in 2001. I finished my coffee and thought about timing. I should explain something about the way I've always worked. I was an accountant for 31 years. Not a glamorous profession, but a precise one. I worked primarily with small business owners, contractors, shop owners, people who built things with their hands and needed someone to make sure the numbers held up. I retired at 62, and I've lived simply since then. The Honda I drive is 15 years old and runs fine. I buy clothes when the old ones wear out. I don't take expensive trips or carry debt of any kind. I have no reason to spend money on appearances because appearances were never how I measured things. Carol was the same way. She grew up in a family that had been through hard times, and she never forgot what it felt like to not have enough. She was generous with people she loved and careful with everything else. We set up the family trust in 1985, 2 years before we broke ground on the house, and 1 year before Daniel was born. A trust attorney named Philip Marsh handled it. He's retired now, but the documents are solid. I've had 2 other attorneys review them over the years, including Margaret Collins, who has handled my legal affairs for the past 20 years. The trust held the house, the investment accounts, and later the proceeds from Carol's small inheritance from her mother. When Carol died, I became the sole trustee. Daniel was a named beneficiary. He received support for education, for his wedding, for various transitions in his life. But he never had ownership of anything in the trust. That was intentional. We wanted him to have stability without entitlement, and I think mostly it worked. He became a careful, responsible person. He was grateful without being dependent. He understood, broadly, that I had taken care of things, though I don't think he ever explained the structure to Renee in any detail. That detail turned out to matter quite a lot. On Saturday, Renee came back with 3 colleagues. She called them a consultation. What they were, really, was an audience. I was getting ready to drive to the hardware store when I heard them come in. 4 voices, heels on hardwood, the professional chatter of people assessing a space. I came downstairs and found them in the living room. Renee introduced me the way a tour guide introduces a historical artifact. "This is Walter, Daniel's father. He's the one who originally built the place." One of the women, blonde, wearing boots that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Looked around the room with the particular expression real estate agents use when they're calculating work. "The bones are really lovely," she said. "The crown molding especially. I cut that molding myself," I said. 1989. Daniel helped me sand it. He was about 3. There was a brief pause. Renee moved on quickly. She walked them through the kitchen, pointed out the cabinet layout, mentioned the countertops were outdated. She talked about the bathroom upstairs like it was already scheduled for demolition. I stood near the doorway and listened. At one point she turned to me and said, in front of all of them, that I had to understand the situation had changed, that Daniel had been carrying a financial burden that she simply couldn't absorb, that the kind thing, for everyone, was a clean transition to somewhere more appropriate for my circumstances. The word burden landed in the room and sat there. Her colleagues looked at the floor. One of them cleared her throat. I looked at Renee for a moment, and then I looked at the 3 women near the window, and I said, quietly, before anyone starts planning renovations, it might be worth asking to see the deed to this property. Renee's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. "Tom, don't," she started. Then she caught herself and said, "Walter, I have a hardware store to get to," I said. "Enjoy the tour." I got my jacket from the hook by the door and left. That evening, I went down to the basement. The filing cabinet stood where it always had, against the east wall, next to the shelf with Carol's canning jars that I'd never moved. For drawers, gray metal, a small combination lock on the top drawer that I've had memorized since 1991. I opened the bottom drawer first. The folder I was looking for was in the back, behind the property tax folders and the insurance records. It was labeled in my handwriting, "Trust Documents, Private." I took it out and set it on the workbench under the light. The first page was the original trust agreement. June 3rd, 1985. The Thomas and Carol Greer Family Trust. 2 pages of foundational language followed by schedules of assets, beneficiary designations, trustee succession terms. The second page I looked at was a bank statement from earlier that month. Current trust balance, $841,000. I set that page down carefully and looked at the wall for a moment. Then I picked up the folder with the deed. 447, no? I should say the address as I've changed it. The Dayton address. The house. The deed recorded in February of 1989 when construction was complete. Owner, Walter Greer. No cosigner. No mortgage. No joint tenancy. Just my name, in clean black type, the way it had been for 36 years. I put everything back in order, closed the drawer, and turned off the light. Upstairs, I made a simple dinner and watched the news. Some things don't need to be rushed. Monday morning I called Margaret Collins at 8:30. Her assistant put me through inside of 2 minutes, which is one of the reasons I've stayed with her office for 20 years. Margaret doesn't make you feel like your time matters less than hers. "Walter," she said, "I heard about Daniel. I'm very sorry." "Thank you," I said. "I need to come in." "Of course. Tomorrow works fine." I didn't explain much on the phone. Margaret has known me long enough to understand that when I say I need to come in, I mean I've already thought it through and I just need the process to start. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. I spent the rest of Monday organizing. I pulled the relevant folders from the filing cabinet and laid them out on the kitchen table in the order I intended to present them. Property deed, tax records by year, insurance policies, utility account histories, the trust agreement and its amendments, the beneficiary designations, and last, the life insurance policy on Daniel, the one Renee had been referencing with increasing confidence over the past 2 weeks. I went through each document slowly, not because I needed to refresh my memory, more because there's something clarifying about handling the actual paper, the weight of it, the dates typed across the top of each page. 36 years of a life, organized into folders, each one telling the same consistent story. Everything in my name. Everything paid from my accounts. Daniel's name appeared nowhere in the ownership records. Not on the deed. Not on the tax filings. Not on the insurance policies for the house or its contents. He had lived here. He had grown up here. He had spent holidays here with his wife for 8 years. But living somewhere and owning it are 2 different things, and the paperwork was unambiguous about which one applied. I made a note of the life insurance beneficiary designation and set that page on top of the stack. Then I made another cup of coffee and sat with the folders for a while, just thinking. The thing about Renee is that she wasn't entirely wrong about what she'd observed. Daniel did help me, genuinely and regularly. After Carol died, he came by twice a week. He drove me to appointments when I didn't feel like dealing with traffic. He picked up groceries if I mentioned I was running low on something. He did yard work in the summers, not because I asked him to, but because he wanted to. He was a good son in the ways that matter most: present, attentive, not waiting to be needed before showing up. Renee watched all of that and drew a conclusion. She saw a son helping his aging father, and she filed it under a category she already understood: the dutiful child supporting a dependent parent. It fit the shape of what she expected to see. An older man in a modest car, shopping with coupons, wearing the same gray jacket to every occasion. A widower who hadn't updated his house since the 90s. Someone who needed looking after. What she didn't see, because Daniel never made it visible, was the direction the money actually moved. The trust had been funding Daniel's life in quiet, consistent ways for years. His graduate school tuition, paid through a distribution I arranged with Margaret's office. The down payment assistance for his first apartment, structured as a loan that I later forgave. The wedding costs, which Carol and I had planned to cover long before she got sick. Various smaller things over the years: a car repair, a cash gift when he and Renee were getting settled, contributions toward a vacation they took 1 year when money was tight. None of it came from Daniel's salary. All of it came from the trust. He knew I helped him. He was grateful for it. But I don't think he ever sat Renee down and explained the mechanics, where the money originated, how the trust was structured, what my actual financial position looked like. He was private that way, and I suppose he assumed it didn't need explaining. It needed explaining. Tuesday morning, I drove to Margaret's office with the 3 folders on the passenger seat. Her office is on the 4th floor of a building downtown. Quiet, carpeted, the kind of place where things get handled without noise. She was waiting for me when I arrived. Coffee on the table, legal pad ready. She went through the documents methodically, the way she always does. Deed first, tax records, insurance, then the trust. When she got to the trust balance, she looked up briefly. "Still in good shape," she said. "Carol was careful," I said. "So was Philip Marsh." She nodded and kept reading. When she reached the life insurance beneficiary page, she set it flat on the table and looked at me. "Renee doesn't know about this." "No. She's been operating under the assumption that she's the beneficiary. She's mentioned the policy several times," I said. "She seems to have plans for it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She picked up her pen and made a note. "Walter, walk me through what you want to accomplish here. Not legally. I understand the legal picture. I mean what outcome you're looking for." "I thought about this. I want the insurance claim processed correctly," I said. "The money goes to the trust, not to her, because that's what the document says. Straightforward. I want her formally notified that she is a tenant in my house, not an owner, and that she has 30 days to make other arrangements." Also straightforward. "What's the timeline?" She gave me 30 days. I'll give her the same. Margaret wrote that down without comment. "Third," I said, "I want this done in a setting where there are other people present, specifically the colleagues she brought through my house on Saturday." Margaret looked up. "That's less standard." "I know. Walk me through the reasoning." "She spent 2 months telling people a version of my life that wasn't true," I said. "She said it in front of her colleagues on Saturday, directly, that I was a financial burden, that Daniel had been carrying me, that I couldn't manage my own affairs. Those women heard it. I'd like them to hear the correction." Margaret considered that. "There's a difference between accountability and humiliation," she said. "I want to make sure we're on the right side of that line." "So do I said. "I'm not interested in humiliating her. I'm interested in accuracy." She made public statements about my finances that were false. The same audience should hear the facts. Margaret tapped her pen on the legal pad once. "Where do you want to do this?" "Her office," I said. "Premier Realty on Henderson. Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock. And if she refuses to meet, then we serve the papers without explanation and she figures it out on her own timeline." Margaret made a few more notes. Then she closed the folders and stacked them neatly at the edge of the desk. "I'll have everything ready by tomorrow morning," she said. "Walter, I've been doing this for 30 years. I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Why did you wait 2 months? You knew all of this from the beginning. You could have corrected her assumption the day of the funeral." I looked at the window for a moment. Gray November sky, a bare tree moving slightly in the wind outside. Because I wanted to see how far she'd go, I said. And because the lesson only works if she teaches it to herself. Margaret nodded slowly. All right, she said. Wednesday at 10. I drove home the long way. Not for any particular reason. Just because I wasn't in a hurry, and the back roads through that part of Dayton are quiet in November. Bare fields, low sky, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. I've driven those roads since before Daniel was born. I thought about him on the drive. Not about the accident or the funeral or any of the weeks since. Just about him as a person. The way he used to sit at the kitchen table as a teenager, doing homework with the radio on low. The summer he helped me re-roof the garden shed, and we worked for 3 days without talking much, just handing each other tools, and it was one of the best stretches of time I can remember. The way he shook hands, firm, unhurried, like he meant it. He was a good person. I don't say that as a father trying to protect a memory. I say it because it was true and because it matters to state true things plainly. He deserved better than to have his death become a property dispute. I pulled into the driveway around noon and sat in the car for a minute before going inside. Tomorrow was Wednesday. The folders were ready. Margaret Collins had 30 years of experience and a very clear understanding of the documents in those folders. I went inside, made a sandwich, and let the afternoon go quietly. Wednesday morning, I woke up at 6:15. Same as always. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, watched the oak tree in the backyard hold still in the cold air. No wind that morning. The sky was the flat white of early winter, the kind that doesn't change much through the day. I drank my coffee slowly and went over the plan in my head one more time. Not because I was nervous, but because I've always believed that preparation and calm are the same thing dressed differently. Step 1. Arrive at Premier Realty at 10 o'clock with Margaret Collins and the 3 folders. Step 2. Request that Renee's colleagues from Saturday be present, specifically the 3 women who had walked through my house and heard her describe me as a burden who couldn't manage his own affairs. Step 3. Let Margaret present the documents in order. Deed first. Tax records. Trust. Insurance beneficiary. Step 4. Say very little. Let the paperwork speak. That was the whole plan. Nothing complicated. Nothing that required raised voices or rehearsed speeches. Just facts, in sequence, in front of the right people. I showered, put on a clean shirt and the sport coat I wear to church, and was out the door by 9:15. Margaret was waiting in the lobby of her building when I arrived. She had a leather briefcase and her reading glasses pushed up on her head and the calm expression of someone who has walked into difficult rooms many times and knows that the difficulty is usually survivable. We drove separately to Henderson Avenue. Premier Realty occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building near the corner, a wide front window with property listings taped to the glass, a bell above the door, the kind of office that tries to feel approachable. I'd driven past it a dozen times over the years without ever going in. We arrived at 5 minutes to 10. Through the front window, I could see Renee at her desk near the back, leaning over something with a young couple across from her. She was in her element, composed, professional, pointing at a photograph of a house with the particular confidence of someone who has made a career out of knowing things. Margaret held the door, and we went in. The bell above the door brought a few heads up. A receptionist at the front desk started to smile the professional smile, and then noticed Margaret's briefcase and recalculated slightly. 2 other agents at nearby desks glanced over. The office had that particular mid-morning hum. Phones, keyboards, the low sound of a conversation near the back. Renee looked up. The sequence of expressions crossed her face quickly. Recognition first, then confusion, then something that was trying to become composure but hadn't quite gotten there. She said my name, Walter, as a question more than a greeting. We need a few minutes, I said. Somewhere private, or here, either works. She stood up and excused herself from the young couple with a practiced smile, told them she'd be right back, guided us toward a glass-walled conference room off the main floor. I noticed she pulled the door almost closed, but not entirely. I think she expected this to be brief. Margaret set the briefcase on the table. Before we begin, Margaret said, I'd like to ask the 3 colleagues who visited the Greer property on Saturday to join us. Renee's jaw tightened. That's not necessary. It's not a legal requirement, Margaret agreed. But it would be helpful. Helpful for whom? For everyone, I said. Renee looked at me for a long moment. I could see her trying to read the situation, cataloging what she knew, what she didn't know, whether this was something she could manage on her own terms. She walked to the door and called 3 names across the office floor. Jessica, the blonde one from Saturday, came first. Then a woman named Carla who I hadn't met. Then a third whose name I didn't catch, who came in last and stood near the wall with her arms loosely crossed, watching. "Renee," Jessica said quietly. "What's going on?" "Nothing serious," Renee said. But her voice had flattened slightly. The real estate brightness was gone from it. Margaret opened her briefcase. She started with the deed. She placed it on the conference table and turned it so Renee could read it. Then she explained what it was, clearly and without editorializing. Property address, owner of record, date recorded, absence of any cosigner or joint ownership, absence of any mortgage. Renee picked it up. She read it the way people read something they expect to find an error in. Carefully, line by line, looking for the place where it would start to say something different. It didn't say something different. "This has to be outdated," she said. "Daniel must have been added to the deed at some point." Margaret placed the second document beside the first. The most recent property tax statement, dated earlier that year, issued to Walter Greer at the Henderson, the date and address. Single owner listed. Property tax records for the past 36 years all reflect the same ownership, Margaret said. She didn't say it pointedly. She said it the way you'd state a mileage figure or a square footage. Just information. Renee set the deed down. Behind her, I could see Jessica and Carla exchanging a glance. Not dramatic, just the quiet recalibration of people who are realizing the room is different than they thought it was. "The utilities," Renee said. "The insurance." Daniel handled all of that. Margaret opened the second folder. Insurance policies, organized by year, going back to 1989, all issued to Walter Greer. Utility account records, the same. Maintenance contracts for the furnace, the roof, the electrical panel, all in my name, all paid from my accounts. Margaret laid them out one at a time. Not quickly, not theatrically, just steadily, the way you lay out cards when the hand is already won and you're simply showing what it contained. Daniel assisted Walter with various practical matters around the property, Margaret said. Grocery runs, transportation, yard maintenance. The financial responsibilities of the house, taxes, insurance, utilities, were carried by Walter throughout. Renee was standing very still. "That's not what Daniel told me," she said. And for the first time since the funeral, her voice sounded genuinely uncertain rather than managed. "What exactly did Daniel tell you?" I asked. She looked at me. "He said he helped take care of you, that you needed support." "He helped me," I said. "That part is true, but support goes in more than one direction." Margaret opened the third folder. The trust documents took longer to explain. Margaret walked through the structure methodically, the founding date, the original trustees, the asset schedule, the beneficiary designations. She explained what a lifetime beneficiary interest meant in plain terms. She explained trustee succession. She explained that Daniel had never held any ownership interest in any asset held by the trust. The current balance, she stated once, clearly, $841,000, as of the previous Friday. The office outside the conference room had gone quiet in the way that offices go quiet when something is happening that everyone can sense, but no one wants to openly acknowledge. Renee sat down at some point during this. I didn't note exactly when. She was just standing, and then she was sitting, and her folder was open in front of her, but she wasn't looking at it. "So Daniel's money," she said slowly. "His salary, his savings, were his," Margaret said. The trust provided supplemental support during various periods of his life. Education funding, some transitional assistance. The details are in the schedule. "He never told me," Renee said. "No," I said. "He didn't." "Why not?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because Daniel was a private person about money," I said. "He didn't distinguish, in his mind, between what was his and what I helped provide. It all felt like his life. He didn't think about the architecture of it." Renee was quiet. Jessica spoke up from the wall. Carefully, respectfully. "What about the life insurance?" Daniel, had a policy through his firm." Margaret placed the final document on the table. The beneficiary designation form, $150,000, issued through Daniel's employer. Beneficiary listed, the Walter and Carol Greer Family Trust. Renee looked at it. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I've already contacted the insurance company." "I know," Margaret said. We'll be in touch with them directly. The claim will be processed according to the designation. The room held a particular kind of silence after that. Not hostile, not triumphant, just the silence of a situation that has reached the end of its ambiguity. The facts had been stated. The documents had been laid flat on the table. There was nothing left to interpret or negotiate about the basic shape of what was true. Renee looked at me. I looked back at her. "Walter," she said. "I didn't know." "I understand that," I said. "You could have told me. At the beginning. You could have asked," I said. Respectfully. At any point in 2 months, you could have asked. She didn't have an answer for that. Margaret gathered the documents and replaced them in the folders with the same unhurried precision she'd used laying them out. "Renee," she said, "you'll receive formal written notice this week. 30 days to make alternative living arrangements. That timeline matches the one you communicated to Walter." Renee nodded once. Very small. Jessica and Carla and the third woman near the wall were all looking at the floor or the window or the middle distance. Anywhere that was not directly at Renee. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "Walter," Renee said. I paused. "I called you a burden," she said. "In front of people. I said it like it was just a fact." "You did. I'm sorry." I looked at her for a moment. She meant it. I could tell she meant it. Not the polished apology of someone managing a situation, but the quieter kind that comes after a person has seen something about themselves they didn't expect to see. "That's a start," I said. And then Margaret and I walked out through the office, past the reception desk, past the listings in the window, and out onto Henderson Avenue where the November air was cold and flat, and the sky was still the same pale white it had been all morning. Margaret unlocked her car and looked at me over the roof. "You all right?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "That went about as expected." "It did." She nodded. "I'll file the insurance paperwork this afternoon. You'll have the formal notice drafted by end of day." "Thank you, Margaret." She got in her car. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked down the street. Ordinary Wednesday morning. People going in and out of the dry cleaner 2 doors down. A delivery truck idling at the corner. The city doing what it does, indifferent to small human reckonings. I walked to my car, started it, and drove home. The formal notice arrived at the house on Friday morning. Margaret's office sent it by certified mail and also had a copy hand-delivered by a courier, which I'd requested. I wanted there to be no ambiguity about receipt. No possibility, later, of a claim that it hadn't arrived or hadn't been understood. I was in the kitchen when the courier knocked. I signed for the envelope, set it on the table, and went back to my coffee. The notice was addressed to Renee. I wouldn't be opening it. It would be waiting for her when she came by later that day, which I expected she would. She arrived around 2 in the afternoon. She still had Daniel's key. I heard it in the lock, heard the door open, heard her footsteps pause in the entryway. The brief hesitation of someone who has just remembered that a space she thought was hers has turned out not to be. She came into the kitchen and saw the envelope on the table. She picked it up and read it standing there, still in her coat. I was at the counter, rinsing a bowl from lunch. I didn't turn around immediately. I let her read. When I heard her set the envelope back down, I turned off the tap and dried my hands. 30 days, she said. The same as you gave me. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Not with the authority she'd had at that same table 2 weeks ago, folder open, legal pad covered in her handwriting. Just sat down, coat still on, hands flat on the table. "I've been on the phone with an attorney," she said. "That's reasonable. He says the trust documents are solid. The insurance beneficiary is clear." She paused. "He also says I don't have any standing to contest the deed." "No," I said. "You don't." She looked at the table. "I have some savings. Not a lot. Daniel and we spent freely. I thought we had more coming." I didn't say anything to that. "I can't afford the rent your attorney is proposing," she said. $3,500 a month plus deposits. I looked at my accounts this morning. She shook her head slightly. "I can't do it." "I know," I said. She looked up. "You knew I couldn't afford it when you set that number." "I set a fair market number," I said. "What you can afford isn't something I can factor in." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was gray and still, the oak tree bare, the garden beds closed down for winter. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. And the way she said it wasn't a demand or an argument. It was a genuine question from someone who was recalibrating in real time, trying to locate herself in a situation that had turned out to have completely different dimensions than she'd believed. "That's yours to figure out," I said. You're 34 years old. You have a career, a license, professional contacts. You have options. My career is taking some damage right now. I heard that, I said. 3 clients transferred to other agents this week. She said it flatly, without self-pity, just stating it. Jessica told me the broker wants a meeting Monday. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Renee, I said, I didn't cause that. I know. The clients made their own decisions based on what they saw. I know, she said again. I'm not blaming you. That was different. 2 weeks ago, everything had been my situation, my problem, my failure to face reality. Now she was sitting at my kitchen table, saying I know with the particular exhaustion of someone who has stopped defending a position they've realized they can't hold. I sat down across from her. Not warmly, but not coldly either. Just sat down, because the conversation seemed to call for it. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. At the funeral, when I told you about the 30 days. She looked at me. You already knew then. About all of it. The deed, the trust, the insurance. Yes. And you just nodded. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being unkind. Because you weren't asking, I said. You were telling. There's a difference. And because I wanted to understand how far the assumptions went before I responded to them. She absorbed that. If I had asked, she said, if, at the funeral, I had come to you and said, Walter, I don't know much about how things were structured. Can you help me understand? What would you have done? I would have sat down with you and explained everything, I said. I would have given you time. I would have helped you get settled, figure out next steps, find your footing. We could have done it quietly, instead of in front of my entire office. Yes. She looked at the envelope on the table. I was unkind to you, she said. I said things in front of people that I had no business saying. I treated you like you were, she stopped. A burden, I said. Yes. She looked up. I'm sorry, Walter. Not as a formality. I mean it. I looked at her for a moment. 34 years old, newly widowed, a career that was wobbling, no inheritance that had turned out to be real, a house she was being asked to leave in 30 days. It was a hard set of circumstances, and she had brought most of them on herself through a particular kind of certainty that had felt like competence but had turned out to be something more fragile. I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. What I felt, mostly, was tired of the whole situation and ready for it to be over. I accept the apology, I said. She nodded. What happens now? She asked. You find somewhere to go? You start fresh. Columbus, maybe. Somewhere with a different market, different colleagues who don't know the history. I paused. You're good at your work when you're not cutting corners on the facts. Build on that. She looked slightly surprised that I'd said it. You think I'm good at my work? You ran that funeral like a logistics operation, I said. You walked into a house and knew what every room was worth inside of 10 minutes. Those aren't small skills. You just applied them in the wrong direction. She was quiet. Daniel loved you, I said. He wasn't a person who loved carelessly. Her face changed then, just briefly. The professional composure slipped, and something underneath it showed. Grief, actual grief, the kind that had probably been sitting behind the activity and the planning and the certainty for 2 months without much room to surface. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. I stood up and refilled my water glass and looked out the window for a moment, giving her the space to collect herself without an audience. After a little while she said, he talked about you a lot. He was proud of you. I don't think I understood why until now. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound like either false modesty or agreement, and neither felt right. I'll be out before the 30 days, she said. I'll start looking this weekend. All right. She stood up, picked up her purse, left the envelope on the table where it had been. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame. That filing cabinet in the basement, she said. I used to wonder what was in it. Now you know, I said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Then she went out, and I heard the front door close behind her, and the house went quiet the way it does when you're the only one in it. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes after she left. The envelope was still on the table. I picked it up and set it on the counter, out of the way, where it wouldn't have to be looked at. Then I wiped down the table, which didn't really need wiping, just because it was something to do with my hands. The clock on the wall said 3:45. I thought about calling Margaret to update her, but there was nothing urgent to report. Renee had confirmed she understood the notice. confirmed she couldn't afford the rent, and indicated she'd be out within the 30-day window. The legal part of this was effectively done. What remained was just the ordinary process of time moving forward. I thought about Daniel. Not about the accident or the grief of the past 2 months. Just about the fact of him, the particular person he had been, careful and generous in private, who had moved through the world with a certain quiet steadiness that I recognized because I tried to model it my whole life. He would have hated this, I thought. Not the outcome, the necessity of it. The fact that it had come to documents on a conference table and formal notices and 30-day timelines. He would have wanted things to be settled the way he settled most things, through conversation, without performance, between people who respected each other enough to be honest. That hadn't been available. But it was over now, or close enough to over that the rest was just logistics. I went to the den and sat in the old chair by the window. The one I'd had since the house was built, reupholstered twice, still the right height and the right firmness, and I watched the light change in the backyard as the afternoon came down toward evening. The oak tree stood in the gray light. The garden beds along the back fence waited for spring. The house was quiet, and it was mine, and it had always been mine, and that fact, which had never been in any real doubt, had been formally confirmed in every way that mattered. I sat there until it was dark enough to need a lamp. Then I turned one on and found my book and read for an hour before dinner. The 30 days passed quietly. That surprised me a little. I had expected some friction, a delayed departure, a last-minute negotiation attempt, some new angle I hadn't anticipated. But Renee was organized when she needed to be, and grief or no grief, humiliation or no humiliation, she knew how to move efficiently once she'd accepted a situation as real. She was out in 18 days. I know this because Ruth Halverson, my neighbor, called me on a Saturday morning to mention she'd seen a moving truck in the driveway the evening before. 2 men, she said. Took about 4 hours. Renee had directed them with the same purposeful competence she brought to everything. And by the time Ruth went to bed, the truck was gone and the driveway was empty. I didn't watch. I'd been at the hardware store that afternoon buying weather stripping for the back door, a task I'd been putting off since September. When I got home around 5, the house felt different in the way houses feel when people have cleared their belongings out of them. A subtle shift in the air, a certain returned stillness. I walked through the room slowly. The guest room where Renee had been sleeping was empty. Clean, actually. She'd stripped the bed and left the linens folded on the bare mattress. The closet was open and empty. The bathroom had been wiped down. In the living room, Carol's photos were back on the mantel. Not all of them. A few were still missing, presumably packed by accident or on purpose, I wasn't sure which. But the 2 main ones I'd noticed were gone the day of the funeral had been returned. They were propped against the wall below the mantel, not hung, just placed there carefully where I'd be sure to see them. I stood and looked at them for a moment. Carol in the backyard, 1992, squinting slightly into the sun with her hand raised to shade her eyes. Daniel at about 7, standing next to the oak tree, which was barely taller than he was at the time. I picked them up and put them back where they belonged. The following week, Margaret Collins called with the final accounting. The life insurance claim had been processed and the funds transferred to the trust, $150,000, as expected. The insurance company had required some additional documentation once Renee's initial claim was flagged against the beneficiary designation, but Margaret had handled it without involving me directly. It had taken about 3 weeks from start to finish. The trust balance is just over $990,000 now, Margaret said. Once we account for the insurance proceeds and the quarterly returns. That's fine, I said. Is there anything you want to do differently with the asset allocation, given the change in circumstances? Not right now, I said. I'll think about it in the new year. There's also the matter of Daniel's personal estate, she said. His car, his bank accounts, his personal property. Those did go to Renee, as stated in his will. She's entitled to all of that. I know. I just want to make sure you're not expecting any of that to come back. I'm not, I said. That was his. She should have it. Margaret paused slightly, the brief pause of someone recalibrating their expectation of what you were going to say. All right, she said. Then I think we're done. Thank you, Margaret. For all of it. That's what I'm here for. A pause. Walter, for what it's worth, you handled this with more patience than most people would have. It wasn't patience exactly, I said. It was just waiting for the right moment. Whatever you want to call it, she said. It worked. Ruth Halverson came by Thursday with a pot of soup. This is something she does in winter. Shows up with soup and stays for an hour, and we talk about nothing consequential, which is exactly the right kind of conversation to have in November. She's been doing it since Carol died, and I've never asked her to stop. She sat in the chair across from mine and wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "So, it's over." "It's over," I said. "How do you feel?" I thought about that honestly. "Tired," I said. "And fine." Both at the same time. Ruth nodded. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For believing her." "Victoria, Renee, whatever." Ruth shook her head. "She told me at the funeral that you were having trouble managing on your own. That Daniel had been carrying you. And she paused. I believed her. I've known you for 36 years and I believed a woman I'd met twice. It fit what made sense to you," I said. "Old widower, grown son helping out. It's a reasonable thing to assume." "It wasn't reasonable. I know you, Walter. I know what you built here." She gestured at the house without looking at it. "I should have trusted that." "You didn't do any harm," I said. I felt like a fool when I heard the whole story. "Don't," I said. "Everyone filters what they see through what they expect. That's just how people work. The problem wasn't that you made an assumption. The problem was that Renee turned an assumption into a campaign." Ruth considered that. Stirred her soup. "Is she going to be all right?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "Eventually. She's competent. She'll land." "Columbus," I heard. "That's what she mentioned." Ruth nodded. "Fresh start. Sometimes that's the right thing." On a Sunday morning about 2 weeks after the house was emptied, I drove out to the cemetery. I don't go every week. Carol and I talked about that once. She said she didn't want me to be one of those people who felt obligated to show up on a schedule, that she'd rather I came when I had something to say. So I try to honor that. I had something to say. I parked and walked across the grass, which was stiff with frost, and stood at the 2 stones that are side by side, Carol's and now Daniel's, which was still new enough that the edges hadn't softened yet. I stood there for a while without saying anything internally or externally. Just stood. Then I told Daniel what had happened. Not all of it, just the outline. That the house was still the house. That the trust was intact. That Renee was going to be okay. That I was okay. I told him I wished he'd explained things to her more clearly while he had the chance. Not because it would have changed what was his and what was mine, but because it might have saved everyone some difficulty. I told him the oak tree he used to climb was still standing. I drove home the long way, through the back roads, past the bare fields and the farmhouses. The sky was pale and cold and very still. I got home around noon and made lunch and sat at the kitchen table with the Sunday paper. The house was quiet in the way I've come to understand as its natural state. Not empty, not lonely, just settled. The particular quiet of a place that has been lived in long enough to carry its own weight without needing anything added. 3 days later, on a Wednesday, the doorbell rang in the early afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door and Renee was standing on the porch. She was holding a cardboard box with both hands. She looked different than she had at any point in the past 2 months. Less composed, less directed, more simply like a person standing somewhere uncertain of their welcome. "I found some things that belong to you," she said. "When I was packing." I opened the door wider and she came in. She set the box on the coffee table in the living room and stood back from it. Inside were photo albums, the ones from Daniel's childhood that had lived on the shelf in the den for as long as I could remember. A small stack of Carol's recipe cards in her handwriting, the ones that had been in the kitchen drawer. A framed photo I hadn't noticed was missing, Daniel and me at a job site, 1990-something, both of us in work clothes, squinting at something off camera. I picked up the framed photo and looked at it. "I didn't realize I'd taken that one," Renee said. "I must have packed it without thinking." "It's all right," I said. We stood in the quiet living room for a moment. "The house looks the same," she said. "Why would it look different?" "I don't know." She looked around, at the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the mantel with Carol's photos back in place. "I had all these plans for it. I was going to get the kitchen, pull up the floors. I had a whole vision." "I know," I said. "It didn't belong to me." "No." She sat down on the edge of the sofa, not settling in, just pausing. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Daniel used to say that you were the most patient person he knew. I thought that was just something sons say about their fathers." She looked at her hands. "I understand it now." I sat down in the chair across from her. "How is Columbus?" I asked. I started a new firm in January. Small office, good reputation. I had a phone interview last week, and they seemed, she paused. They didn't know anything about what happened here. Clean slate. Good, I said. I'm staying with my sister until then. She's in Westerville. She straightened slightly. It's fine. It's temporary. That's the right way to look at it. She was quiet for a moment. Walter, she said, can I ask you something? Go ahead. If things had been different, if I'd come to you after the funeral, respectfully, and said I don't know what I have or don't have, can you help me understand? Would you really have helped me? Yes, I said, without hesitation, even after everything, even after the way I'd treated you before Daniel died. I thought about that honestly. I might have helped you differently than I would have helped a stranger, I said, with more conditions, more clarity about boundaries. But yes, you were Daniel's wife. You were family, even when you weren't acting like it. She absorbed that. I wasted 2 months, she said. You lost your husband, I said. People don't always handle that well. I didn't handle Carol's death particularly well for the first few months. I just handled it quietly enough that no one saw. She looked at me. What did that look like? Handling it quietly. Sitting in the basement for 3 hours, organizing a filing cabinet that was already organized, I said. Something shifted in her face. Almost a laugh. Not quite, but something in that direction. That sounds about right, she said. She stood up. I should go, she said. I just wanted to bring the box. I walked her to the door. On the porch, she turned back once. Take care of yourself, Walter. You too, Renee. She went down the porch steps and along the front walk and got into a car I didn't recognize, smaller than the one she'd been driving before, a rental or a recent purchase. She didn't look back again. I watched until the car reached the end of the street and turned. Then I went inside, closed the door, and carried the box from the coffee table to the den. I put the photo albums back on the shelf where they belonged. The recipe cards went back in the kitchen drawer. The framed photo of Daniel and me I set on the desk where I could see it from the chair. Then I sat down, found my book, and spent the rest of the afternoon reading. December came in slowly that year. The first real cold arrived on a Tuesday, the kind that settles in and means business, that turns the ground hard and makes the oak tree in the backyard look like it was always meant to stand against a gray sky. I put the storm windows down, checked the weather stripping on the back door that I'd finally gotten around to replacing, and switched the ceiling fans to their winter setting. Small tasks, the kind that accumulate into a maintained life. I've noticed that the months after a difficult period have their own particular quality. Not relief exactly, more like the gradual return of ordinary time, days that don't carry the weight of something unresolved, mornings that are just mornings again. The coffee percolating, the oak tree, the light changing in the kitchen through the course of a day. I was glad to be back inside ordinary time. I spent one Saturday in early December going through the house room by room, not searching for anything, not inventorying, just walking through slowly, paying attention. The living room was as it had always been. Carol's photos on the mantel, the old sofa in the corner that I've had since 1997 and have no intention of replacing. The crown molding that Daniel and I had sanded together when he was 3 years old, though he remembered none of it. Of course, he was too young. I remembered it for both of us. The kitchen was quiet and orderly. The cabinets I'd chosen from a catalog in 1988 were still exactly right for the space, regardless of what any real estate agent might think about their vintage. The table with the slightly uneven leg, fixed with its folded piece of cardboard. The percolator on the counter. The den had the photo back on the desk, Daniel and me at the job site, 1990-something, both squinting. The recipe cards were in the drawer. The filing cabinet downstairs was exactly as it had always been, 4 drawers of organized decades, doing what it had always done, which was simply existing as proof. I stood in each room for a moment, not with any particular sentiment, just standing in a space I'd built and paid for and lived in for 36 years, noticing that it was still itself. That was enough. Ruth Halverson came by the following Thursday with gingerbread, which she makes every year in December. We sat at the kitchen table and she told me about her daughter's new house in Columbus, a Victorian that needed work, good bones, terrible kitchen, and I listened and offered the occasional observation, and we drank tea and let the afternoon go by at its own pace. At one point she said, "Have you heard from Renee?" "Not since she came by with the box," I said. Ruth nodded. "I saw something online, one of those neighborhood forums. Someone had posted about what happened, The whole story, apparently. From the couple who was at the real estate office. She paused. It got a lot of responses. I imagine it did. People were. Some of them were angry on your behalf. Others were more sympathetic to Renee. Grief does strange things, some of them said. That's true, I said. How do you feel about it being out there like that? I thought about it. I don't mind, I said. If anything comes from it, maybe it's that people think twice before assuming what they think they know about someone else's finances, or before deciding who in a room is powerful and who isn't based on what they're wearing or what they drive. Ruth looked at her gingerbread. You never did replace that Honda. Runs fine, I said. She laughed. It was a good sound in a quiet kitchen on a December afternoon. I've been thinking, since all of this settled, about the shape of it. Not about Renee specifically or the legal particulars or the meetings and documents and 30-day notices. More about the underlying thing, the assumption that quiet means weak, that modest means struggling, that someone who doesn't perform their stability must not have any. It comes up more than people realize. I've talked to a few people since October who've had versions of the same experience. Different circumstances, different relationships, but the same basic structure. Someone decided what your situation was without asking, and then acted on that decision with complete confidence, and you had to figure out how to respond without losing yourself in the process. My neighbor Harold Chun, for instance, 81 years old, retired professor, drives a car that's older than mine. His son-in-law spent the better part of a year treating him like a dependent, speaking over him in conversations, managing his schedule, referring to his house as eventually hours in front of Harold's own friends. Harold told me about it at the hardware store one morning in November. We were both buying the same size of weather stripping, which I took as a good sign. He's handling it in his own way. He's not someone who moves quickly, but he moves carefully, and he knows what he has. I told him what I told myself through all of October. The facts don't change because someone states a fiction confidently. Paper doesn't lie. Patience is not the same as surrender. He nodded and said he'd keep that in mind. I hope he does. The week before Christmas, I went down to the basement. Not for any particular reason. Just to check on things, the way I do every few months. Pipes, the furnace, the general condition of a space that most people ignore until something goes wrong. The filing cabinet was where it always was, against the east wall, next to Carol's canning jars. I stood and looked at it for a moment. For drawers. Gray metal. A small combination lock I've had memorized since 1991. 36 years of a life, organized by decade, each folder labeled, each document filed chronologically. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I just stood there for a moment in the basement of the house I built, in the quiet of a December morning, and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who knows exactly where everything is. Then I turned off the light and went back upstairs. The percolator was ready. The oak tree stood in the backyard. The house was mine, and it was still, and it was enough. If you've watched this far, I'd like to hear from you. Not because this story needs anything added to it. It's finished. But because I suspect some of you have been in a version of this room. Not necessarily the legal specifics, but the experience of being underestimated. Of having someone look at your quiet life and read it as weakness. Of waiting for the right moment to simply tell the truth and let the facts do what facts do. If that's you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something I've always liked about knowing that someone in a different city, at a different hour, is sitting with the same kind of story. If this one meant something to you, a like helps more than you might think. It's what keeps these stories reaching people who need them. And subscribe if you want to stay. There are 2 more stories coming up next that I think you'll find worth your time. One of them involves a family business and a signature on a document that someone assumed was routine. The other is quieter, a retirement, a storage unit, and a decision that took 20 years to make. Both of them in the same way this one does, with the facts on the table and the house still standing.